I suppose many of the audience are Conservatives or former Conservatives, but everything you said made sense to everybody in this room, and we applaud you. We applaud you for the stance that you have taken, and the broad sweep which you have taken, and the fact that you clearly have an international dimension to your thoughts. Thank you, Kelvin. Ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker is Anthony Coughlan. Anthony is Secretary of the National Platform for EU Research and Information and has been a senior lecturer in social policy at Trinity College Dublin. Anthony was Joint Secretary of the Common Market Defence Campaign. He campaigned against Ireland joining the Common Market. Now, when I went through his biographical details, I thought that his campaign started in 1973, which I thought was absolutely tremendously praiseworthy. But just talking to Anthony, he actually started his campaign, I think, in 1961, because because the Irish government did, of course, see that when Macmillan tried to negotiate entry to the common market, that they would need to go in also. And indeed, I think most of us in this room today want to see good relations with the Irish Republic, and also believe that working together makes many better prospects, both for Ireland and for us. And it is indeed quite unfortunate that Irish politicians have created a division between us and taken Ireland into the euro, so that Ireland has had to have all of these problems, which Kelvin has so eloquently illustrated, while the country with which they trade, and there's so much free movement of people, has had the benefit of a free exchange rate. So we do have so much in common with Anthony, and he has been a prolific campaigner from the very beginning on the common market, on accession, and also on every single treaty change that has taken place, which has deepened the European Union and removed even more powers from its member states. He's been a prolific campaigner and author, and today he's going to speak on why Brexit should be accompanied by Ireland's exit. Ladies and gentlemen, Anthony Coughlan.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to congratulate you and other people here for the tremendous democratic victory that you achieved on June the 23rd last by taking the first step in restoring democracy and independence to the United Kingdom and to this state. As the Chairman mentioned, I've been a long campaigner on this issue. It has dominated more or less all my adult life. I was particularly glad as a result of the referendum because I took part in the first United Kingdom referendum in 1975, the one which the Harold Wilson government held about staying in the EC at that time. And I recall speaking on the same platform as Tony Benn in West London on that occasion. And on another occasion with Sir Richard Boddy, who I'm glad to hear is still with us, and the late Peter Shaw. And the only British politician I ever sent a letter of congratulation to was done in 1974 when I wrote to the late Enoch Powell, congratulating him for urging people to vote Labour to defeat Edward Heath's attempt to keep Britain in the EEC. He sent me a nice letter of thanks. The establishment in the Republic of Ireland was in a state of panic when they heard of the result of the United Kingdom referendum. They didn't expect it. Some still almost can hardly believe that it has happened, and they hope it will not really happen yet. We, of course, repeat referendums in Ireland. We repeated the Nice Treaty referendum in 2002. We repeated the Lisbon Treaty referendum in 2009. Exactly the same referendums, exactly the same treaties, no changes made in them. But the people are made to vote twice to get the right result, and they hope, some people hope that that will be done in Britain. I don't think it is going to happen. You're going to have more steel in your backbone, I hope, than with our own citizens. But they hope it won't happen. They hope, for example, that Mrs. Hillary Clinton will be elected next Tuesday, and that as president she will put pressure on Mrs. May and our colleagues to stay in the EU together with the Germans and others. Because you remember, it was America more or less established the original EEC way back in 1957, pushing the original coal and steel community as a kind of economic underpinning for NATO in Europe at the time of the height of the Cold War. It was President Kennedy, late President Kennedy, who pushed Harold Macmillan into applying to join the EEC way back in 1961. So, and President Obama came here, of course, during the referendum to say you'd be at the back of the queue if you didn't vote to remain. So it's clear what American policy is, and if Mr. Trump is not elected, well, you'll have Mrs. Clinton, who may well be expected to put pressure on the British government in this whole area. And our people are hoping that. One of the grand congendrums of Irish politics is Mr. Peter Sutherland, former Irish Attorney General, leading man in Goldman Sachs, GATT, former EU Commissioner and so on. He said in the day after the referendum result, and was quoted in the Irish Times as saying, this result needs to be overturned. And you'll be damn sure that Mr. Sutherland and his colleagues are working behind the scenes at the present time to try and subvert it in one way or another. And our establishment, our government and our leading politicians are hoping they will succeed. The official position of the government of the Republic of Ireland is, of course, that the Republic should stay in the EU if the United Kingdom leaves. That's the official position. What actually would happen in practice, I believe, will depend on the character of the UK-EU agreement at the end of the day when it has come to. Because it's quite clear that it's going to put us on the spot. And I would not be at all surprised if, at the end of the day, the Republic of Ireland did not take moves to go with the United Kingdom out of the EU, depending on how the game moves over the next 2 years. Because there are very few good arguments for the Republic of Ireland to stay in the EU if the British leave. And I'll just go through one or two of the key points. One of the reasons for the ardent Europhilia of the Irish political class, all the main political parties, the media in general and so on, though the public is much more critical, as shown by the no votes to Nice and Lisbon, but the reason for the Eurocritical Europhilia of so many of our political class is that for decades Ireland was a major net recipient of EU funds, particularly on the agricultural policy, because we were a major agricultural producer. But that situation has changed. Since 2014, the Republic of Ireland has become a net contributor to the EU funds. And from now on, the grants to the farmers, the regional funds, research grants and so on will be Irish taxpayers' money coming back, as is of course the case with the United Kingdom. And this will very much change Irish public attitudes, I can assure you. Most Irish people are still unaware of this fact, and the media in Ireland are really rushing to tell them, but it's going to change the argument quite fundamentally in the Republic over the next few years. The second obvious point relevant to Ireland is that, of course, if the Republic remains a member of the EU when the United Kingdom leaves, the north-south border within Ireland must inevitably have a wide range of EU-related dimensions added to it, affecting trade, travel, and different laws and regulations on both sides of it. For example, without the United Kingdom as an EU member state beside it, the Republic would be in a much weaker position to withstand pressure to adopt continental norms in EU crime and justice policy, which in principle we are and Britain is committed to under the Lisbon Treaty, in such areas as trial by jury, the presumption of innocence, habeas corpus, and so on. If Britain isn't there, is it likely that the Republic would stand on its own to defend these traditional norms in the years to come as a closer integration and harmonisation took place in this whole area if the Republic stayed in the EU when Britain leaves? Maintaining the long-established Anglo-Irish common travel area, which has existed since the Irish state was established in 1922, and minimising north-south border controls were determining factors in the Republic's original application to join way back in 1961. And as the chairman mentioned, I wrote a letter of criticism of that time. But we applied to join simultaneously with the UK. When the British application was revived in 1972-3, we went along with Britain at that time. And these arguments are still very relevant. If the United Kingdom government were to decide that it was in its best interest that the Republic should also leave the EU, and that's a decision the British government must come to. It is in a position to use the continuance of the common travel area between the two states as a major bargaining chip. For successive Irish governments and generations of Irish politicians, the existence of the common travel area between the Republic and the UK has been a kind of social safety valve. It has made it possible for the negative consequences of the Irish state's failure to provide enough jobs at home for its own people to be avoided by its exporting much of its labour force to Britain because of the ease with which Irish emigrants can come here and settle here. Pressures for relevant economic and political reform within Ireland have thereby been reduced. Irish policymakers and the Irish government and politicians can be expected to do whatever they can to prevent this situation changing. For this reason, among others, they will be most anxious to ensure the continuance of the Anglo-Irish Common Travel Area. And if the British government wants to encourage the government of the Irish Republic to leave the EU, it has that strong bargaining card in its hand. Another relevant issue, which hasn't been mentioned today, is the whole security and defence dimension. There's little doubt that if the EU holds together, that there will be further integration in the area of security and defence. It's not for us to say what British government policy should be in this area, but it surely would be the case that British policymakers would have reservations about the Republic of Ireland becoming closer involved with EU defence in the years to come, which is likely to happen if it stays in the EU and the United Kingdom should leave. The IRA campaign from 1970 to 1994 delayed or put off probably for generations the possibility of a united Ireland, but the British government has said that they would look positively on Irish unification if a majority of the north of Ireland should ever want that. But would it be likely to do that if, in fact, at some time in the future, suppose this hypothetical situation arose, which all Irish politicians say they would like to bring about, some form of north-south unity, and if the south of Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, was in a close security bloc with the EU, dominated by Germany, while the north of Ireland was with the United Kingdom, obviously this changes the whole calculus of policy making in relation to security and defence between the two islands, and it's an important issue in this particular area. Of course, the situation, as far as we're concerned, has been hugely complicated by our folly in joining the Eurozone. That was undoubtedly the biggest mistake ever made by the Irish state. It was made when the Eurozone was set up in 1998, 1999. We did so on the assumption the British were going to join it in a year or two. And our political elite said, we will show how communautaire we are, how pro-EU integration we are by going first, expecting the British to follow in a year or two. This is the time when Tony Blair was Prime Minister. But of course, that didn't happen and won't happen. And now we're caught in the euro, which of course has been a huge disaster for us, particularly in that it led to Mr. Trichet and the European Central Bank imposing the burden of some 64 billion of Irish bank private debt on Irish taxpayers in order to prevent banks going bust in the Eurozone. And that has hugely diminished public support in the Republic of Ireland for the euro, I can tell you. So it's very important to bear in mind that the Republic of Ireland is a kind of outlier when it comes to the Eurozone. All the other Eurozone countries do half or more of their trade with one another, but we in fact do 2/3 of our trade, that's exports and imports combined, outside the Eurozone. We do roughly 1/3 of our trade with the Eurozone, that is the other 18 member states of who use the euro, 1/3 of our trade, exports and imports together, 1/3 of our trade with the United Kingdom, Britain and Northern Ireland, and 1/3 with America and the rest of the world. So our genius politicians join the euro, but even though we do only 1/3 of our trade with it, and we do 2/3 outside the Eurozone. Now, if Britain and the United Kingdom leaves the EU, we will in fact be doing most of our trade with English-speaking countries outside the EU, with Britain, the United Kingdom, and North America. We send 3/5 of our exports, 60% of our exports, and rising, to outside the Eurozone, and to be outside the EU when the British leave. So that, of course, makes us rather different. And it has been suggested that the Republic of Ireland could withdraw from the euro might be the only country in the eurozone that could withdraw from it without causing a general crisis for the eurozone as a whole. And that if the Irish government concerted such a plan, privately of course, with the Germans and the other eurozone countries, it might be possible at the end of the day the Germans might look favourably on this course. Because, of course, the Germans and others will try and resist Britain leaving the euro, I believe, leaving the EU, if it can be avoided with the Americans and so on. In the next 2 years, there'll be endless battles over this issue. But if at the end of the day the United Kingdom persists, as I believe it will and hope it will, and it genuinely leaves the EU, well, then Germany might be willing to accommodate Ireland in that respect, Germany and France, because France follows along with Germany, so Germany really runs the show. And might be willing to accommodate a departure by Ireland and Britain outside the EU, or accommodate the departure of the Republic of Ireland along with the United Kingdom out of the EU as a whole. It would probably facilitate German dominance of the remaining EU, which is an important consideration, no doubt, for German politicians. So those are all very relevant to the Irish situation, and I've little doubt that over the coming 2 years, depending on how the negotiations between Britain and between the United Kingdom and the EU work out, that the Irish government and public opinion and politicians will gradually adjust their thinking to accommodate this new situation. The Irish Daily Mail, which is an Irish version of the Daily Mail that circulates in Ireland, they held an opinion poll only last week, which asked people what they thought. Would they prefer free trade with the United Kingdom outside the EU or free trade with the EU? And 40% of those who said they prefer free trade with the United Kingdom rather than with the EU. And this was a remarkable result before any adverse effects of Ireland staying in the EU when Britain leave actually began to be felt. So I think that's an important gauge of how public opinion might go in relation to this very important matter. Finally, we don't need a referendum in the Republic to leave the EU. We have a written constitution, and of course any new EU treaty surrendering sovereignty requires an amendment to that constitution, which is the reason for our periodic referendums in the Republic on EU treaties. But the original accession treaty, the EEC accession treaty of 1972 rather, we had the constitutional amendment that was inserted into the Irish constitution at that time said the Irish state may join the European community, and it was a permissive power, not a mandatory or compulsory power. In other words, the Irish state, or the Irish government on behalf of the Irish state, were given permission by the people to join the EU at that time, join the then EEC. European laws, of course, has primacy over Irish law in any matter relating to the treaties under the Irish Constitution. But the legal advice we have got is that it's open to the Irish state to leave the euro, as long as there's, of course, a majority approval in the Irish Parliament. In fact, it's the only practical way of doing it, because we couldn't there's no legal way for leaving the euro currency without leaving the EU also. And it's not unpractically to have a referendum on leaving the euro. You still wouldn't have any euros left if there was going to be a referendum on it. But it's not constitutionally required in Ireland, a referendum, as long as it becomes the wish of the Irish Parliament and the Irish government, which I believe could happen over the next few years, depending on how the British negotiations go and if the British government plays its cards in the particular way I've implied. Finally, just to say that the points I've just made have been elaborated on in a study group carried out by a number of Irish economists and lawyers who've been working on the subject over the last few months, and who come to the conclusion that the overwhelming balance of advantage for the Irish state and the country as a whole, and Northern Ireland, Southern Ireland, is for the Irish state to leave the EU along with the United Kingdom, that Brexit should be accompanied by Irexit, and that is set out in a study group report here, which I've got a number of copies, and if anyone wants them, they're welcome to have them, or I can send them to you if you let me have your email addresses after the session is over. Thank you very much.